Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our panelists. We're delighted to have you join us, and welcome to all of our audience. I gather there are some 250 of you who are joining us this evening, so it's absolutely fantastic. My name is Nina Modi. I am a professor of neonatal medicine at Imperial College London and a neonatologist at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, and president of the Medical Women's Federation. We are extremely pleased to be co-hosting this webinar together with the British Medical Association. Just a few words about the Federation. The Medical Women's Federation has a long history of advocacy for progressive reform. The MWF was founded over 100 years ago. It developed from the Association of Registered Medical Women at a time when there were only 9 members representing all the sum total of the medical women's workforce in the UK. And over the decades, the Medical Women's Federation has championed various progressive reforms, such as the right to receive information on issues like birth control. We voiced our opposition to marriage bans on women in employment, and were delighted when, according to our history, in 1939, the War Office agreed to appoint medical women on the same pay as men. However, come the end of the war, women went back to suffering discrimination. Then in 1946, the first women members were appointed to the British Medical Association Council, and then with the coming of the NHS, all medical schools finally opened their doors. But for a long time, they operated a quota system for women, with only 20% of entrants allowed to be women. Today, of course, you all know that women make up about half of all NHS doctors, and about 66% of entrants to medical schools are women. The NHS needs women, and therefore they should not be the victims of pay discrimination. In large part, this emerges because of a perpetuation of the premise that family and childcare and other caring responsibilities are women's issues. They are not. They are society's issues. They're all of our issues. And we feel that a focus on maternity rather than parental leave dominates policy decisions in a very unhelpful way. This widens the pay gap. So we'd like to challenge these gendered norms of female caregiving and male breadwinning. We don't believe that gender-based assumptions have any place in the 21st century workforce. And it's only when society comes to appreciate that these discriminations have an impact on all of society and all of us that we will achieve gender parity. We look forward to the discussion that's about to unfold. Once again, our aim for the webinar is not to go over problems, but to get real about the solutions. Helena, over to you to introduce the first of our panelists.
Well said, thank you, Nina. And just a reminder to everyone watching that we are recording this evening so that people can view the webinar with the panelists and the questions and answers on the BMA website, and there'll be a link for the MWF to share. So I'm going to medicine, occupational health and lab medicine, and is a portfolio GP working less than full-time, and is an academic GP involved in training the current generation of Glasgow medical students. Mary-Anne is a friend. She's represented BMA members on various committees, both locally and nationally, for a number of years, and is currently the co-chair of the BMA's Medical Academic Staff Committee and on the executive of BMA's Scottish Council. Mary-Anne, hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you for coming again to the BMA, and you're the interim chief executive of the NHS Confederation, and was first worked in healthcare as a porter, I didn't know that, and a care assistant before becoming a management trainee in Stoke-on-Trent. And you are a chartered companion of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, a trustee of the Employers Network for Equality Inclusion, the NHS Retirement Fellowship, and chairs of the Cavendish Coalition, which the BMA is a member of social care and health organisations. Thank you very much for coming along this evening.
Thank you for having me.
And over to Nina, please, to introduce the other panelists.
Let me introduce our last few panelists, not least of all. So, Carol, welcome, Professor Carol Woodhams. Carol is Professor of Human Resource Management and Head of Department at Surrey Business School. Carol's research career is focused on topics of equality, diversity and inclusion across many settings, and over the last few years she specialised in the decomposition of gender, ethnicity and disability pay gaps in the NHS and in higher education settings. Carol led research on the gender pay gap in Medicine report, which was published in December last year. Welcome, Carol. It's lovely to have you with us. And now Jane, Professor Dame Jane Dacre. Jane and I have known each other for many years, and Jane is well known to the UK medical establishment. Jane was the independent chair for the Gender Pay Gap report, working with Professor Carol Woodhams. Jane's currently Professor of Medical Education at University College London and President of the Medical Protection Society. She's a consultant rheumatologist at the Whittington Hospital in London, and she's held many other posts, including, but not limited to, immediate past President of the Royal College of Physicians, Vice Chair of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, Medical Director of the MRCP UK Examinations, and Vice President of the Royal College of Physicians. I could go on for a very long time. Suffice to say, Jane, thank you very much for being with us this evening. Welcome all.
Thank you.
Helen, oh no, now I think it falls to me to ask the first question.
It does. We've read it.
Jane, this is for you. Jane, how confident are you that the recommendations in your report will be actioned? And can you tell us who you feel has overall responsibility for ensuring that the recommendations in your report are implemented?
Well, it's interesting that's an interesting question for you to ask me, because I've recently taken on a role where I'm working with the Health Select Committee in trying to gather evidence about how many of the government's pledges actually are actioned. And so it'll be sad if our own report gets judged as wanting. However, I think these reports often make a lot of recommendations and not all of them are implemented. When we were coming up with the recommendations in the report, we had a lot of conversations, both with the Department of Health and also with people who we had tasked with making changes to try and get things or trying to get the pay gap to narrow. So I hope what we did was a lot of footwork to make sure that it lands well. However, the report has been complete for a while. It was ready for publication pre-COVID. It got stuck in the dreadful calamity that has been and still is COVID. And we were, I think, very fortunate to get it published when we did. And before it was published, we did a lot of work with the Department of Health and Social Care to set up the sort of structures for a steering committee, including a list of people who are going to be on it. All of that now has slowed down a little bit. But prior to coming on this evening, I've been in contact with the Department of Health to say, well, where are we now? And what they have said is that they're clearly passionate about making the NHS workplace better for women and for women doctors, and recognise the problems that we've identified in the report. They've committed to establishing an implementation panel based on the structures that both Carol and I have seen earlier, and that they've been talking to other government departments to make sure that that panel exists. They also, and quite rightly, have started to think about inequalities in the round, because since our report was completed, there's been the Black Lives Matter problem, and there's been the dreadful issues about ethnicity and susceptibility to COVID, particularly amongst healthcare workers. So the dialogue has broadened out. So I think the commitment is there. The detail we've still got to work on. I'm hoping that we made the recommendations in the review pragmatic enough for most of them to be implemented. So simple question, long answer, as ever.
Thank you very much, Jane. I'm sure we may come back to how we can help with implementing the report during our discussion. Helena.
Just before we go on, I wondered if any of the other panelists wanted to comment on their confidence about the recommendations being actioned, or whether we should move on. Okay, we'll move on. I'm going to ask Carol a question, if I may, Carol Woodham. What data should be recorded and by whom in order to tease out the relative impact of other characteristics, for example, age, race, less than full-time working, etc.?
Thank you, Helena, for your question. And this gets to the heart of the analysis that we were able to undertake for the Gender Pay Gap in Medicine review and what might be achievable in the future. And you can only conduct an analysis. Your analysis is only as good as the data that you're working with. So that's a really pertinent question. And in the review, we do make recommendations around data improvement. Having said that, given that there are kind of 3 broad specialty groups in medicine, being the hospital doctor track, the GP track, and the academic doctors as well, each one of those has their own separate data collection, data activities in terms of instruments. So the first thing to say is that in terms of robust and straightforward comparisons, these would be a lot easier if everyone was in the same database. But we had to analyse these separately, and we did our best to replicate across the 3 major streams in order to be able to make the same sorts of comparisons. We had great data access thanks to the support from the Department of Health and Social Care. We had really comprehensive data access. We got the best that we could. And it's particularly on hospital doctors using the electronic staff record. This was fantastic, with the exception of the length of service field. So there are a few fields which are kind of absent or could be improved. And on the SR, the length of service field is one in particular, because the length of service is recorded as you start with a trust, not as is the start of your career. But we think that doctors are fairly homogeneous on the starting point of their career. So we used age and age squared as kind of proxies for experience and length of service, but that isn't perhaps ideal. Data from GPs would be greatly improved if all the data fields that were captured were actually completed. So the kind of quality of data that is returned from primary care settings is not the best. And so that would be an improvement there. And again, you know, personal indicators and recording hours of work and length of service would improve our ability there. What we have got is the capacity, given such a large amount of data, to make these intersectional comparisons and do a lot around ethnicity and disability and sexuality and religion. And we're currently kind of taking some of those analyses for us. We've got permission from the Department of Health and Social Care to take forward some of these calculations. So I can talk more about that later on.
Gosh, that's going to be quite something to hear, and I look forward to that. And thank you for your analysis. Nina.
Thank you very much. I've got a question for the whole panel, if I may, and that is, the question is, what would you advise the focus of men should be to reduce the gender pay gap? And Danny, I'm going to come to you last, if I may. But let me kick off with Farah. Farah, could I ask you to respond first of all, please?
Well, I guess the first thing is they need to understand that there's an issue, and I think that's sometimes difficult for people to understand. I think many people, possibly myself included many years ago, think equal pay, and well, we have equal pay. What's this gender gap, pay gap all about? So I think it's understanding the issue, understanding the challenge, and then being an ally, because this is a societal issue. It's not just a women's problem, it's everybody's problem. And we want to get the best talent doing the best, fulfilling their role to their best potential. And if you know that you're damned to never, reach sort of similar, compare with your male colleagues, it's pretty, distressing. So we need male allies, just like we need in all sorts of other issues with, with bullying or with people sort of not being supported through career progression, etc. So male allies, understanding there is an issue, and then working together to solve the issues, because many of these male allies are in the positions of power. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you. Marianne, can I come to you next, please?
I'm struggling a bit with the answer to this, given that I've been qualified for a considerable number of years, because I feel that the attitudes that I encountered as a junior doctor that are still around, and I think that the younger doctors may be able to have a different emphasis, but I'm not sure that the older members are, and maybe I'm doing people a disservice, but there's definitely major societal issues in UK society, and I think that's a very difficult one to tackle. But obviously we need to sort something out. This is waste of training, waste of resource, waste of personnel, waste of people, and so we do need to sort it out.
I can't necessarily speak to who they are, except that many of them actually very kindly signed their names to their emails, and their emails were full of backlash comments, you know, real hateful comments. Some of them were so distressing I had to take them to my colleagues for support, my feminist colleagues for support. However, since the launch of the review, those comments they died off. Now, whether it's because people are otherwise engaged, I don't know, but there was really very, very little, if not no backlash. So I think that the case is starting to be won in terms of the size of the gender pay gap and the reasons for it. And so I think that the best thing that men can do, as Farah said, is to be allies, but I think they also need to critically examine their own position in this hierarchy and the power that they have. They need to be open-minded, and then they need to think differently around career structures. They need to support change, and sometimes that means critically reflecting on your own power and your capacity to guide through change.
Carol, thank you for sharing that with us. That is very, very, very sobering indeed. And I guess what one must say is that I hope that by the fact that you are getting less of these sorts of very, very distressing comments is good, but one needs to hope that these are not going underground and they're not festering somewhere. And that's why you're absolutely right. We do need male allies to lance this particular boil. Jane, let me turn to you, please.
So just picking up from what Carol said, one of the things that we used to do during the research for the report is to share these issues. We called them pay gap deniers. So there are some pay gap deniers out there who say that there isn't a problem at all, and what are you fussing about? Just roll your sleeves up and get out to work like we men do. But one of the things that strikes me is that the structures in the NHS were set up in 1948 and they haven't changed much. And so what we need to do is make sure that the structural changes within the NHS reflect the changes in society. Now, for me, the changes in society aren't happening quick enough. We're still hearing and seeing that during COVID, women are doing all the homeschooling and looking after the children, and referring back to what you said earlier, Nina, looking after children and having children is a parental responsibility, not a maternal responsibility. And our society doesn't do that, doesn't accept that. So in order to change the gap, we've also got to change the culture in our society in the way that people treat and think of women.
And Jane, you're absolutely right, because if you think within the UK alone, let alone on a global perspective, within the UK alone, different communities are on different points in this particular journey. And I think when we speak about intersectionalities, we need to reflect on that as well. But Danny, let me come to you now, please.
I think the points are really well made. I think particularly about allyship, particularly about the privilege and the power that comes with being a man. I think that there are also some interesting reflections that I'd share from the research we did with Professor Seeley last year, There are two communities around our board tables, and I appreciate NHS board jobs on the be all and end all of people's careers, but the two communities where we see particular underrepresentation of women are finance directors and medical directors. And so whilst there are absolutely the society-wide problems and the NHS-wide problems, there are particular challenges within particular professions, it would appear, but also in terms of our approach to particular professions. And again, the people making these decisions are often men. So there are a whole set of things for us to look at, but it is absolutely about accepting the problem. And it is disappointing to hear that at this stage, even within this last 12-24 months, Carol got that kind of invective from male colleagues. And it is absolutely accepting that we have the power, we have the privilege of that power, but we need to use that power to make change.
Would any of the panelists like to come back with final thoughts?
Nina, could I possibly come in here?
Please do.
There is one thing that I've heard at BMA meetings, that there is a confusion about equal pay and the gender pay gap. And I wonder if that's something that people are going to need a lot more education about. And what is it? You know, what are the specific details that are causing that? Because ever since I qualified, the Equal Pay Act was in force. It shouldn't even have needed to be discussed further. But so that's my extra thought.
Helena, I think time to move to you in the next question.
Thank you for all that discussion. And I'm going to ask Mary-Ann, I'm keeping you busy, I'm afraid, this evening. What advice do you have for your medical students in Glasgow at the start of their careers to avoid being disadvantaged?
Thank you, Helena. I've given this some thought, and the first thing I'd like to suggest is that you need to know yourself. And that means understand yourself. It's hard when you're 17 or 18, but I think try and think, you know, who you are, what are your thoughts about your career, and keep yourself true to yourself throughout your lives. I think you need to address the fact that you may have some health issues, you may have some disabilities, you may have a chronic disease. Now, I'm fully in favour of people working with these added difficulties, but I think it's important to keep them with yourself and address what are these. And you may need to think about that in your future career, because I think people should be realistic, because life is quite tough. And I think that to know yourself and to understand your disability. I have a disability which I didn't realise I had as a medical student. And if I'd chosen surgery as a career, it would have been a disaster. So, and they used to say, you know, if you have a bad eczema, should you consider being a surgeon? Well, you know, you can treat your eczema, but I'm just making that as a suggestion. I would hope you would make some friends. I would hope you would find mentors, either in the medical school or perhaps just when you go to hospital places, hospital placements, because I think that's important to have some mentors, because somebody's out with your particular position can maybe assist. If you're having any difficulties with studying, please seek help, because it's there at the university. Some people may have coped at school with their mild dyslexia, but when they come to university, it's much harder to do, and they need to try and get some help with that. If you've already got domestic responsibilities, you may have some issues about where you're going to work in the future, how you're going to work. It is, of course, manageable to do things with domestic responsibilities, but it can be more challenging. You need to be money-wise, and with that in mind, seek out some scholarships. You'll have to seek them out. They won't be obvious. You'll need to try and source them, but you could maybe get some extra cash that way. Try to get your degree first time, because obviously that is much more straightforward. It means you've managed to fit things in the shortest space of time. But don't despair if you can't, because there are plenty of medical graduates who've maybe failed a degree and they've passed in a resit. What about your career? What appeals? So that's a difficult one, because several things might appeal to you, and until you've tried them, you might not know. And don't be afraid if it doesn't work for you the first time to move on and try another career. There might be some reasons that the first career is not going to work. You may not get a job at the first attempt, but you could go back and try that again. And then you need to allow for the fact that you're going to carry on your training throughout your life. That's one of the challenges of medicine, but it's also one of the benefits, that you're always learning. And well, I suppose I could mention the children. So my thoughts about that are, your working life is very long, and you may be planning to have children, but you also may end up being the main carer. And certainly you will be working long after your children have moved out of the nursery. And also, if you want to support them in tertiary education, that's quite expensive. So you need to keep that in mind as well. There are some physical things related to having children, obviously. There's pregnancy. Are you going to be healthy? Is it going to go well? Are you going to have any sequelae? There's breastfeeding, which is very rewarding, better for the baby if you can do it, but it is also challenging. And then there's exhaustion that goes along with having children. And I think a lot of mothers could relate to that, but we get through it. And the other thing is, what if your child had something that needed hospital care? That's something you cannot plan for. You cannot allow that at all. And that's a very challenging situation. It's challenging in terms of time, emotional situation, visits to hospital, and worry. So just worth thinking about. Childcare is variable depending on your own circumstances, but let's not think it's just us that need to worry about childcare, because other people need to worry about it as well, and somehow they sort it out. And except there's a shift system, but then there are nurses who are going to try and go back to work with babies as well. So it's not just doctors that are going to be in this situation. And of course, workplace nurseries might help a lot in that case. So those were really my thoughts, and I'm sure there'll be some people who may disagree with me or may have other thoughts.
Thank you, Mary. I suspect we might have one or two people that might like to add regarding advice to medical students to avoid being disadvantaged by the gender pay gap if they're starting out now. Anyone like to?
Knowledge is power, isn't it? Actually understanding. I'm sort of equally shocked in equal measures as I learn more and more about it. So being aware of it. But at the end of the day, I would advise people who are at medical school to do what you love, because you're going to be doing it for a long time and put your energy and passion into it. But clearly there's a work-life balance, and you'll have to make decisions about your career. But knowledge is power, and knowing there's an issue, because if you don't know there is, you're always going to be disadvantaged, and be a champion for it and for other issues.
I think the other thing to say, and apologies for saying this, but you probably need to choose your specialty. You can see in the report where the biggest pay gaps are. So if your main view of medicine is to earn more money, there are specialties that you might choose where you would be able to earn more money. And until we've sorted that out for anybody coming through, that's something just to be aware of if that's your focus. But I wanted to say that we shouldn't put people off. Medicine is a brilliant career. It's a fantastic thing for women to do, and women are really, really good at it. So please don't be put off, anybody that's thinking of a career or thinking of moving through a career in medicine. I would have thought that all of the medics on the panel would say that medicine is brilliant.
Jane, I completely agree. There is no career where you can work all around the world and work part-time if you want to, and work beyond retirement age, as long as you keep your training up and your qualifications. I think it's brilliant. You can take it anywhere, I feel.
And I'm another one that's going to agree with that. I too spotted, Jane, that I think if you are motivated by money and you look at the current gender pay gap, look to where the gender pay gap is less and where you're likely to make more private money. And one of my pieces of advice to trainees male or female, is to buy as much childcare as they can afford if they have children, much more than you think you need, because that gives you time for yourself. And time for yourself, of course, is very, very important, or time for your relationship. So whether, you know, whichever sort of parent you are, if you do choose to have children, buy as much childcare as you can. Nina.
Thank you very much. Farah, I think I have a question for you, and it's a topic that we've discussed previously. Now, you work in a very, very competitive specialty. You're extremely successful. There are few women in surgery compared to other specialties. And having children is often cited as an important reason for the gender pay gap. But you've pointed out that you don't have children, and yet you do have a gender pay gap. Why is this?
I've often asked myself this question, and so I think it's a bit of a double whammy. I'm a cardiac surgeon, so that's a disclosure. And as Prof. Dacre's already alluded to, the gender pay gap is different in different specialties, and sad to say, in surgery it's higher. So full-time equivalents, it's 21%, in cardiothoracics is 30%. And I feel a lot of that, when you take out the seniority, etc., you'd expect that by consultant level, it might have sort of leveled out. So I was absolutely, and of course we talk about the motherhood, you know, the parenthood penalty, but it's really the motherhood penalty, isn't it? Those people are suffering. So I was quite interested when I was delving into the report last week. I presented at the Royal College of Surgeons of England, that if you look at consultants and compare like for like, a woman consultant, I'm sure I'll get corrected by Carol J, that if people have taken maternity leave, and a surgeon like myself who hasn't, I've been off for other reasons, but I didn't take maternity leave, mainly because I didn't get pregnant, there's a discrepancy or difference in my pay of 7.2%, so not that big. But if you compare my pay, as in one's pay, not mine specifically, to a male colleague, so a male colleague who hasn't taken any time out, and myself who hasn't taken any time out, it's 19%, a difference of 19%. So it's not just because people take time out to have children or to care for them, etc. Of course, you have to care for them afterwards or pay for them to be cared for. So, and what really shocked me, so that was a bit of a revelation, but what really shocked me was that women who do take time out to have children, they're sort of suffering this 20 to 25% gap in their pay, and they have to sort of work till 65, so not quite retirement age, to actually catch up with their male peers. And of course, there's lots of reasons that we can delve into, and I think one of the big things is probably all the things that extra payments, CEAs, etc. And it's not that women aren't interested or you know, aren't going for that. If you don't actually know that your colleagues have negotiated something, there's no transparency. So I think data's king, transparency is key. And yes, I learned something by reading this report, which I was a bit miffed about.
Farah, thank you for that. Can I follow up? There is an issue here about women perhaps carrying on doing, or anyone carrying on doing what they want to do and love doing. So if you want to carry on being a surgeon and you jolly well don't want to go off and be medical director, why should you be penalised for that? What would you say to that?
Well, that's interesting, and I think it was sort of touched on in the report as well, because I don't do private practice. I quite like using my time to do fun things like this. And for example, with the CEAs, as that was one sort of big section, if you do go into your medical management, if you choose to, and that's great if that's your aptitude and you're good at it, you not only are being paid more for those responsibilities, as opposed to me, who I might spend my time sort of doing webinars or visiting medical schools, which is great fun. So you're already being paid more. And then if you apply for a CEA, 2 of the 5 sections are at national level are all to do with managerial type responsibilities. So and yes, you have space for teaching and training, but who's valuing that role modeling, the mentorship, the caring about inclusivity and diversity? You know, that's not value. So it's how you value things. And then of course the people, and of course, as I said, senior colleagues making the decisions and it's about what we value in society and in medicine. So those are my thoughts. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
That leads on to, if I can turn to Danny now. Danny, this is a very important point, I think. How do we carry on valuing people who want to practice medicine? And as Farah says, you may want to go off and do other things, and that's fantastic because we need a very diverse workforce. But if you actually want to carry on practicing medicine, getting better and better at it and doing your best for patients, how can we ensure that that is valued as much as someone who diversifies their medical role?
And the Clinical Excellence Award scheme, which Farah touches on and Dame Jane rightly touched on in her report as well, is clearly something that needs reform, both in terms of how the national scheme works and also how the local scheme functions. There are particular challenges with the national scheme. I think we know, and we've known for some time, that fewer women apply for National Clinical Excellence Awards than men, and I'm not sure we've done enough to understand why that is and what can be done about it. And because of the way in which the scheme presently works, because of the progression through the tiers, the sort of metallic tiers, then actually that also limits then the ability of women particularly to get, or the representation of women rather, to get higher awards. So that is something that needs reform. ASIA, I think probably as a consequence of the fact that Jane had been commissioned to look at to do her report, are reviewing how their scheme works nationally. And there are conversations starting with the BMA and the HCSA about how the local schemes can be reformed longer term as well. And I think you're right that there is something about how those schemes can acknowledge the diversity of achievements and contributions. There's also, my time in the NHS proper, there was always a concern that there was a particular advantage that academic colleagues had over non-academic colleagues. There's a whole set of reasons which are seen as unfairnesses within that scheme, within the profession, which may well discourage people from applying, and particularly discourage women and ethnic minorities from applying. So if we are to have those schemes, and I do think on balance there is value in having schemes that recognise and reward the kind of contributions you described, Nina, we do need to modernise them. It's a long time since we've done that. That's the most substantive point. There are clearly others, and I do think the point about transparency in terms of payments is an important one. Clearly there are roles within organisations, and they're not just management roles, they're also educational roles, research roles, which do attract additional reward or attract time allowances, and I'm not sure we are as transparent as we should be about those. There's a different set of challenges probably in primary care and academia, but I'm less qualified to talk about those. But those are two things that I think would make a difference: reforming ACA, reforming Clinical Excellence Awards, and having much more transparency about payments.
Thank you, Danny. Just for our delegates, our audience who are with us today, I'd just like to give you the facts. So the ACCA themselves published data in 2018 showing that 77% of applicants were men, 23% were women. This is reinforcing your point, Danny, that women tend not to put themselves forward for ACCA awards. However, of note that both men and women have a 30% success rate. So this is something why Medical Women's Federation has long been doing our utmost to encourage women to put themselves forward for ACCA awards. And similar sorts of numbers relating to BAME applicants. So 71% are white, 22% are BAME. However, here we do see a differential according to ACCA's own figures, with 32% of white applicants being successful and only 23% of BAME applicants being successful. So there's work to be done here across several fronts. But I'd just like to end this bit of our discussion by asking Carol and then Jane whether or not your report addressed issues of gender pay gap in relation to women who do not have children.
Thank you. So yes, indeed, this was part of the analysis, and it's something that we're taking forward in much more detail now. So you cannot identify from the ESR who has children and who doesn't, because those things are not recorded. So really, I'm going to talk in terms of part-time working, less than full-time working, rather than childcare, because we don't actually know the reason why more women than men choose to take part-time working. But it is the less than full-time working that has the most considerable impact on the gender pay gap. And it's likely that childcare is the reason for this in most of the cases. However, what we do know now is that women doctors without breaks or part-time working are still disadvantaged, especially in the promotion to consultant. This is where the barrier occurs with regard to women without breaks or part-time working. So we've taken forward this specific point, and we're doing analysis on this now, and we're almost ready to publish, given a fair wind and some acceptance on that point. So the review shows disadvantage even if women don't have children. I think potentially because, and we're going to do qualitative follow-up on this, is that there's an association that one day they might do so, and this is a potential form of discrimination. And there are also assumptions around, there's a potential assumptions around the cohesiveness of a team, that a sort of homogenous team is more likely to be successful than a diverse one. These sorts of understandings may permeate some medical practice and prevent women from being appointed to consultant in equal proportions.
Oh, fascinating and very worrying. Thank you. Farah, did you want to come back in?
Yes, I do. And I do. That's really interesting, because one of the things we were talking about at college was at the Royal College of Surgeons of England was looking at attrition data. We know that lots of senior positions are taken by men, and we really want to get to the nitty-gritty. Why are women surgeons falling down? Why is there such an attrition rate? And/or, I mean, it's a tragedy both in personal terms, but if they've gone through their training and maybe done exit exams, higher surgical exams, and then not getting through that last stage, and maybe even leaving, and how attractive are we making it, to how much support are we getting? And I know it's coming from all different specialties as well, that, you know, how do you support people when they were returning for whatever reason? So I think sort of getting that attrition data is just so important. And that last step, not last step, because some people may choose to be, you know, work in different ways. You don't have to be a consultant, but if you want to become a consultant, what role can sort of specialist associations or colleges play? For example, in surgical appointments at consultant, we have roles, as a college has a role as an assessor. So the hospital may ask for a college assessor who gets involved in shortlisting, and just to see sort of fair play is done. I don't know if that happens in other specialties, but there's a role to make sure that the right thing is done and people are having a fair experience, you know, not just in terms of getting to the interview, being shortlisted appropriately, and then fair play being done in the interview process. So there are you know, we can actually action some things. There's lots more work to be done to dig into the detail, but we have the tools to try and get more information and act on things. So I think that's really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. And Jane, let me bring you in for the last comment on this. You're muted, Jane. Jane, you're muted.
Yeah. I wanted to pick up on the issue of women without children still having a pay gap. And one of the interesting things that comes across is that the sorts of activities that Farah described as loving don't get paid. And so women tend to go into extracurricular activities in medicine that isn't paid. A lot of it is around education, mentoring, nurturing, supporting others, bringing on others. Whereas the sorts of work patterns that men want to do as extra work are things like waiting list initiatives, or operating on a Saturday morning, etc., etc., and those accrue a salary. So that widens the gap, and we thought that ACCEAs were going to be a much bigger problem in the gender pay gap, but it's in fact these additional extra activities that are paid, and the male, those additional activities that are attractive to men accrue more money than those that are attractive to women. So that's just an interesting difference between the two. And then just a very quick point on attrition. In the work that we were doing, the problem is when people aren't on the ESR, we can't measure, we don't have access to them, we can't find them. So that the people that leave, we don't know why they've left. So some work on exit interviews or reasons why people might leave the profession would be really, really welcome.
Thank you, Jane, and sorry, Farah.
If I might just come in very briefly, I know I've had my sort of time, but this is exactly where we mustn't have people falling through the gaps. You know, you can't have the college saying we want the data and JCST saying, oh, it's kept by the deaneries, etc. And exit interviews, so important. Everyone should know what at what stage of training somebody's come off. So I echo what you've said.
Thank you all very much. Gosh, that was a very rich discussion indeed. Helena, let me hand over to you now.
We also have a history, a modern history of women GP partners leaving partnership in their late 30s, because we haven't talked much about primary care, where of course seniority payments, which were in some ways a bit like RCEAs, they've been gotten rid of. So I think if CEAs are going to be looked at again, they probably need to be extended to be looked at for SAS colleagues and primary care as well, and what value we put on all of the activities. Certainly, I used to do research in primary care. Research wasn't pensioned through the NHS pension scheme, which will widen my pension pay gap in years to come. So while we were talking about our careers as doctors, I would be interested in everyone on the panel's thoughts on why women doctors who are in relationships with male doctors suffer more impact on their pay and shoulder more unpaid caring duties than women doctors whose partners are non-medical. And if you on the panel have any suggestions on how we can improve that. This was one of those fascinating things that came out of the study. I hope we've interpreted it correctly, Carol.
Yes, indeed, yes. We thought that we were equally really impressed by that particular finding. And what I would say is that it's probable it's because that medicine has such a rigid structure, and this continues for so long into your career, that missing a particular stage is highly consequential, whether you're male or female. And the more of these stages you miss, it's kind of like snakes and ladders, isn't it? As I understand it, if you miss a stage, you find yourself down a snake. So you're not treading water where you are, you're put back. So to have domestic partners that are both trying to navigate this lack of flexibility at the same time is actually bound to result in at least one of them withdrawing support. So I think that medical doctors prioritise a career quite early on, and others may not have to. So those with partners outside of medicine may not have to do that with the same extent and to the same consequence. For me, it's a question of the structures. What we saw was that it was the structures of medicine that really are so very consequential for whoever takes time out.
Thank you.
An interesting thing about this also is geography, because the regions of the NHS are not based on the roadmap or the train map. And for trainees where there are a man and a woman who are married and they're in, for example, east of England, that could stretch from Boston in Lincolnshire to Peterborough. And they might need to live or rotate or have jobs from one end of the east of England to another. So there are geographical things that make those decisions much more difficult, because if you've got a child that needs to be in nursery at 8 and you've got a shift that starts at 8, you have a fight, don't you?
I have a feeling, thank you for raising that, Jane, because I have a feeling, Carol, if my memory serves me well, that actually there were also regional differences in the difference between the two-partner doctor household. I have a feeling the Southwest, it was less obvious. I raised the Southwest because I work in the Southwest. There was a regional geographical one. I can't remember what the London difference was, but I think there were significant differences.
Yes, thank you. So the pay gap in London is lower than the pay gap in other regions, mainly because there are more women there and they've been there for longer. So they are more senior in their career. So, and the Southwest is probably the region that is the most opposite to that particular scenario.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you want to take the next one, Nina?
Thank you, Helen. So, Danny, this is for you. This is another one of our pre-submitted questions, and it also speaks to the fact that, as I said in my opening remarks, we want to get real about the solutions. We've rehearsed the problems, but we want to get real about the solutions. So the question that was submitted by one of our attendees is, what can be done to bring about changes now and not 10 or 15 years down the line?
A really good start would be setting up the implementation group that Jane has described, given it took us the best part of a year to publish Jane and Carol's excellent report. So I think there is something about picking up the pace now that we've got clear recommendations. There are, I think more broadly, there is something about the organisations I represent, the professions and professional societies that you represent or are part of, being held to account for diversity in a way that we're not, frankly, in healthcare or in professional organisations. It should be seen, you can't be good, or you can't truly be a good employer, you can't truly be a good university, a good primary care organisation, a good professional association if you do not take diversity seriously. I think a recommendation that our report and we share with Jane and Carol's is the application of something like Athena Swan to the NHS, because we see, and I think Jane and Carol rightly see, that has driven change in academic institutions, starting first in STEM and then more broadly. And clearly we've had the experience of Sally Davis making silver Athena Swan recognition a prerequisite for NIHR awards 10 years ago or so, 9 years ago or so. So I think there are some things that can be done that will drive behaviour change. And whilst the true benefit of that behaviour change may take longer than we'd like, I also do think some of that behaviour change will be felt more quickly. There is a final thing which we've sort of touched on in part, and Carol touched on in her last remarks, which is that the consultant contract we introduced in the UK, somewhat controversially, I accept, 16, 17 years ago is no longer fit for purpose. The very long incremental pay scale that we have in place is no longer fit for purpose. And the reform of that contract, which is an objective that the BMA and the HCSA and employers do have in common, will require investment by the government. Any move from one contractual form to another contractual form always has a cost. And our previous attempts together to try and reform that contract have founded on the fact that the NHS hasn't been able to afford the cost of that reform. But that is, if we're looking for practical actions, practical things to ask for, that need to invest in reform, alongside some investment in some of the other things that Carol and Jane recommended, are things that can be done and should be done quickly.
I agree. Investment in reform for the benefit of all of society, as I also said in my opening remarks. If 77% of the NHS workforce are women now, it's time some monetary value was put on how can I put this, on women's work. Jane, would you like to come in about the role of the implementation committee in perhaps introducing an Athena Swan type equivalent assessment?
This was one of our recommendations, and what we did before we published the report was to go around to talk to organisations to see whether they would be comfortable with with that as a recommendation, and people said yes. A slight difficulty is that I understand that the NIHR is no longer using Athena Swan, and that there are some problems with the way that Athena Swan has been implemented. And so I think we probably need to move on from thinking that Athena Swan is going to be the thing, but there does need to be some measure of equality in the assessment of organisations in the way that they get their funding.
And if Athena Swan did an awful lot of good in its time. I think very often as really novel initiatives go through time, they may sometimes change the dynamism and the youthfulness with which they're first implemented. But they certainly, I am a clinical academic, and I watched universities change their behaviour because of the impact of the NIHR requirement for an Athena Swan. And it sometimes does take that sort of bold move, even for a short period of time, to actually change an organisational ethos. So I wouldn't be held back, Jane, by the fact that NIHR has now changed their view. They still welcome Athena Swan demonstration, even though they are not predicating their funding upon it. So I think this might still work very well for the NHS indeed. Helena, I think I have to turn over to you now for the next question.
Thank you. We've got some questions coming in from the audience. So I thought I'd ask one that we've been given this evening. So this is open to any or all of you. Do we have to tackle discrimination in the workplace to help reduce the gender pay gap? And if so, how might this be best achieved?
Well, shall I kick off? The answer is clearly yes. But interestingly, in the report, we found it quite difficult to match discrimination directly with the gender pay gap. And I think that sadly, that may be because people who suffer seriously from bullying and discrimination don't hang around. But there are clearly, and from the qualitative aspects of our work, there are clearly inappropriate behaviours. And we need to have a zero tolerance to inappropriate behaviours, and we need to deal firmly and fairly with those that exhibit them. Having said that, that's really difficult. I was sent a direct message on Twitter this week from a female who was asking me advice on how to deal with sexual harassment from a senior colleague. And she asked me because she didn't have anybody else to turn to. And she had spoken to somebody senior who'd said, this person's a good egg, don't start being difficult about them. And we do need to out that kind of behaviour, and we need to have a zero tolerance to it.
Perhaps I could come in here, if that's all right. Jane, I'm just appalled, but perhaps you've become an informal mentor on Twitter. People find mentors in various different places, and at least she's found you, but it's absolutely appalling. And I have to say, I do agree that for some people it's easier just to leave the job, because the questions that could be asked, the fact that you might not get your reference, actually, I think is pretty important. I've gone for an interview for a job, produced a couple of good references, and they've said, well, you haven't worked for them in the last 3 months. So obviously I found another 2 references from people that I'd worked with, but it's that sort of thing. And I think that the reference situation is quite a challenging one. And I've always said a lot to people about references, be very careful about references, don't be away from work too long, you might not be able to get a reference. So these are things that I didn't even think to suggest, when I was sort of talking about medical students, but references are very important. And then there's the informal reference, because I've had that as well. I've had a phone call at home about somebody that a junior doctor, junior to me, and what did I think? Would I give a reference? And I was not labelled, I was not listed as one of the referees. Obviously I gave a good reference because I had no qualms about it, but that's the informal reference system Just my thoughts.
Any other positive things perhaps that women in the workplace might do? We've got very successful women here.
I think it's if I can come in, I think it's very easy. Discrimination, it does go on. I think from my experience of people who've contacted me, it tends to be more bullying, discrimination, undermining, you know, not to minimize it at all. And it is far easier to give someone advice than if you're actually experiencing it and feeling alone and the walls come in, because you do go to, you know, you go through all the, you know, sort of layers, your colleagues, your peers, the senior people, but it is very difficult calling somebody out, and if it becomes a he said, she said. But absolutely, it can't be tolerated, and it's everybody's responsibility to sort of change that culture and have a culture of sort of inclusion, almost like, you know, we're contemplating when you join your whichever college or whichever specialty, you know, you almost want a code of conduct, and every single trust or health board, if you're in Wales or Scotland, have values and this and that. It's about time people started actually behaving in the way they claim their values are. So it needs to be nipped in the bud, which is easier said than done. But if anybody in the audience is experiencing anything, talk to somebody, you know, share your load. There are plenty of people to support you, individuals and groups of people. I'll stop there. I think Nina had her hand up.
I was only going to follow on from what you're saying, Farah. It's really important to talk to someone, and it can sometimes be hard to find someone to talk to. But if anyone finds themselves in that situation, this is why the Medical Women's Federation has got open doors and a listening ear, a confidential listening ear, because I think all of us who are of a particular vintage know that it can be hard to find someone to talk to when you really need someone. But MWF is certainly there for you.
And of course the BMA is as well, and you might need the trade union support as well as the advice. And right, Nina, did you want to pick another audience question perhaps?
Yes, thank you. There's a very interesting one here, and one that actually my younger self of many years ago relates to. So it comes from a junior doctor who says, I don't know much about how consultants and GPs are paid. These aren't conversations that one tends to have with one's seniors. How can we learn more about pay structures and CEAs and the like? And I think, again, that strikes a chord with many of us who just found out along the way, and no one sat us down and talked to us about this. So let me turn to the panel. Who would like to kick off with a response to this?
Absolutely. I think at some point you do need to learn about these things, and it's good to be given some sort of guidance as opposed to having to sort of search all about it. And people are funny about money and power, and, you know, even when you're talking with peers, I'm not talking about my colleagues, they're very good. People don't like talking about it. I don't know if it's just a British thing or an English thing, but a lot of specialties, certainly in cardiothoracics, and I think some of the surgical sort of colleges have sort of professional development courses that you tend to go to or do at some point along your training. And I think that's a really great time to introduce those concepts. And I went to one about sort of how to negotiate your job plan, etc. Of course, I was rubbish at it and didn't have a clue, but it does need to be taught alongside all the other things, because if you, for example, go into general practice, which I know nothing about, you need to run a business essentially, don't you? So these things need to be taught along the way.
Thank you, Farah. Carol, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. So two things to say. The first is that it was a great surprise even to the members of the steering group that the ESR, the electronic staff record, has 15 pay fields. So there are 15 ways to earn more money, and CEAs is only one of them. And CEAs is not actually the one that causes the most disparity. It is the additional payments and premia and bonuses other than CEAs that cause the gender pay gap. The second is that there was almost an entire lack of awareness that negotiation was even possible. And when we posed the question in our qualitative data, do you negotiate? Have you found yourself to be successful in negotiation? And there was a lack of awareness amongst many of our interviewees and survey respondents that said, no, I didn't even know that was even possible. So I think it's kind of one of those organisation learning things that once you know it's possible, you get better at it, but that the lack of transparency around GP appointment salary and ESR additional and extra payments needs tackling.
Thank you, Carol. I couldn't agree with you more there. Thank you very much. Would any other of the panelists like to come in? I think this is a really important point about, and it speaks also to transparency, because if we don't tell young doctors about this, the likelihood of there being transparency in what happens subsequently is going to be very much diminished.
There was a question from the audience a little while ago asking whether medical students should be taught about the gender pay gap. I imagine that you might be keen that happens, listening to the last answer.
I think it's one of our recommendations, but I suppose, I mean, in my understanding of medical students, they are not that interested in that kind of thing when they're students. So I suppose they need to be made aware and they need to know where the information is. But I think if you sat them down and started to teach them about it, they'd say, but I want to be a cardiothoracic surgeon, what's it's got to do with me? So I think there is a timing thing, but certainly the information should be made available.
Thank you. There's one more question on the side panel. This is about caring responsibilities. Oh, it's disappeared off the screen. Just as I was about to ask the question, it's disappeared from view.
It was, Helena, it was about caring responsibilities being present both at the beginning and at the end of one's career, and women kind of taking a double whammy hit at the start of their career when they have their own childcare responsibilities, and then possibly at the end of their career when they have responsibilities for elderly family members.
Can I come in here then?
Thank you.
I've had both, and they're both challenging, but I think it's part of life. I think that not to be involved with your family at either end of the demographic would be a miss. You know, that's what life is. You know, having relatives, having family. You know, there's value there. I think we have to learn. Also, we are better as doctors. I think we're better able to empathise with our patients, and particularly for me, I was on a major learning curve with my elderly parents, and I've been able to share the things I've learned with patients and their families, and I wouldn't have known that without having been there. So I think we have to do it. It's rite of passage at either end of life.
Thank you, Marianne. Farah, did I see a hand there?
Yes, I guess we all have different sort of setups and lifestyles, and you know, I helped sort of care for my mother-in-law for a little while towards the end of her life, and it is stressful trying to go to work and she's run out of a warfarin and she's got a mechanical valve. You know, you have to sort of juggle all these things. But what we do have to remember, and this is slightly veering off the gender pay gap because it's talking about responsibilities, we have to remember that we're relatively well paid as a profession, ignoring the gender pay gap, and there are other people all across society dealing with how to manage young children and childcare, and they need solutions too. You know, clearly we need better childcare within the NHS for, you know, all sorts of groups of people, and they're negotiating family life and children, you know, what to do with your children after they've left school or homeschooling. So it's not a challenge that's unique to us, and we all have to find a way that we manage it that suits us, you know, whether the childcare is sort of you know, nannies, etc. And the thing about childcare, and I know I'm not an expert because I don't have children, but I'm a cardiac surgeon and I'm good at that, and I've not had heart surgery myself, but you know, it is a small relative, I'm told by people who have had children, it's that painful bit where it is costing a lot of your salary is a relatively small time for lots of joy later in life. And I'll stop there because.
So I have a question for the panel, which follows on very nicely from this bit of our discussion, and that is that let's take a slightly different approach to levelling the pay gap, and let's talk about how, I'd love to know your views on how we might incentivise or encourage or support men in childcare roles, because some of the work that MWF has done through our male allies has demonstrated, and indeed work by other organisations, has shown very clearly that a larger proportion of men would like to work less than full time than currently do, and a growing proportion of men feel that they are being denied their human rights to be dads, because of course there's still a certain stigma attached to a chap who wants to take time off to be with his kids. So let's turn this on its head, and let me ask the panel, how can we incentivise or encourage or support or motivate, celebrate and champion men who wish to take on more of these caring roles? Who would like? Marianne, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so one of the things that the BMA achieved was shared parental leave, but it was for junior doctors. And obviously there's a lot of other doctors who become fathers and mothers, and it really, that the shared parental leave should really be shared further up the salary scale. So I think that's a practical thing that could happen. But I have to say that, you know, as I meet other doctors in various areas that I'm involved in, I am running into families where one of the father is maybe doing a day at home with the children. I think there is a cultural shift there. So that's happening, but whether it's happening fast enough or enough of it, I don't know.
You're right, Marianne. It's happening, but it's not happening fast enough, and we need to help it on its way, I think. Danny, what are your thoughts?
I think we have seen in the civil service and elsewhere that the shared parental leave approach can make some change. Clearly, as I think people have touched on a number of times in the conversation, there are deep-seated attitudes here at societal level, but there are deep-seated attitudes as well within the NHS and within the profession about the stereotypes are strong. And there is something about, I appreciate my internet dropped off when we were having the conversation about workplace training around discrimination, but I do think there is a need for the NHS across all parts of its workforce to challenge some of these stereotypes, to celebrate the role models who do not conform to the norm. And I think we have more chance of doing that than many organisations. But again, the incentive for doing that, if it's not Athena Swan, it's something like Athena Swan. It's something that holds organisations to account, that incentivise organisations to make that change, and that will translate into incentives and profile within our workplaces as well.
Thank you, Danny. I love that. Let's celebrate role models who break the mold. I love that. Jane, do you have?
Well, I was just, and Carol can correct me, but I think that there is a big penalty for men that choose to work less than full time. So I think that there's a bit of a legacy thing here, that anybody who chooses to work less than full time for looking after children has a penalty on their payment that continues for a long time during their career. So I think recognising that and reducing that long-standing penalty, but Carol will probably have a better understanding of that data than me, but I think that penalty is there for men who choose to work less in order to look after their children. So we both have the problem, it's just that men do it less.
It's also true that the uptake of shared parental leave by men has been absolutely minuscule. But Carol, do you have anything to add to Jane's points?
So I would say that probably the biggest cultural shift that you could manage is to make the part-time penalty less disadvantaging for women, and then men will see the sense of taking it up. So if you can shift it so that it's less disadvantaging for all, then men might be more encouraged.
Very good points. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it probably is time to begin to wrap up a little bit. It's been a fascinating discussion with role models here in front of our faces. We started with hearing about how confident we are the recommendations will be actioned, and Jane Dacre, thank you for reminding us about the implementation group. I hope that we'll have the BMA and the MWF there, making sure it happens. Carol, you told us a little bit more about the further data analysis in response to looking at intersectionality. Thank you very much for that. We went on for some advice for medical students, and there was a lot of discussion about culture and allyship, and we've heard some ideas for solutions. Not least, I think anyone here, there are some executive summaries on the BMA website, I suspect on the MWF website as well. And I think if anyone asks us tonight about what we've been doing, and they refer to, well, you know, equal pay for equal work, and just getting across to people that it's the gender pay gap compares the average pay of all women and all men working in a sector, so that we can explain it to our colleagues, so we get that allyship, so that men can help us to change things. Nina, have you anything more to say in summary?
I have one or two small things to say in summary, but I was just watching the questions come in, Helena, and watching the clock too, and I think that we've just got a few more minutes left. So I wonder whether this would be a good opportunity to just go around the panel and ask them for their final reflections. Shall we do that?
Yes,
we do that? Marianne, let me bring you in first, please.
I think that perhaps this should be publicised more to medical students, and we maybe need to bring that forward to the Medical Students Committee. You know, because I think there are quite a lot of young medical students who are quite interested in these issues now.
I agree, Marianne. I think that there's work for both BMA and MWF, dare I say it, to do on this front. So I think that point is very well made indeed. Carol.
Thank you.
Last reflections.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation to think about reflections. For us, in terms of the major findings of the report, are that as long as we can retain women and that they progress in equal measure, then a lot of the gender pay gap will be overcome. We need reform around pay structures to prevent the disadvantaging effects of part-time working and career breaks. This seems particular to medicine, but it's progression and retention that are the key factors in reducing the gender pay gap. We have to think about gender pay gaps as being a proxy for all inequality. So that's why, you know, it's such a complex and long report, because there are so many facets and so many layers to a gender pay gap. So men need not to be kind of defensive about this, really, because it's all in the report, it's all explained in the report, but we need to work and we need to try and reduce the implications of just being a woman and the different types of career that they may choose, and how this plays out in medicine.
Thank you, Karen. I like the way you made the point that the gender pay gap is a proxy for inequality, because we all know that there are many inequalities sadly alive and well in society, and we are here today talking about the gender pay gap, but there are many intersectionalities along that and many other aspects of this discrimination. So a very good point to make. Thank you. Jane.
Well, just thinking that the NHS workforce is, there aren't enough of us. The NHS needs all of us doctors and all of us women and men to work together, particularly at the moment. Look at all the staffing shortages caused by COVID. So we need to fix this, because we have to keep the women in the workforce for the NHS to thrive. As more and more women come through medical school, we need to keep them working, or we're all going to fall over.
You're right, Jane. We need to fix this. We need to fix this. Then with that, let me turn to Danny.
I agree with Jane. We can't afford to waste an ounce the precious talent that's available to us, and clearly we are doing that right now. There is a substantive set of actions that Jane and Carol have set out, and you know, our job in England is to put pressure on the department to take those forward, and in the other nations that we all work in as well, for them to kind of join in that effort as well. But there are a set of things that we've been given to do, and we need to get on and do them.
Thank you, Jenny. Farah, final thoughts.
I think everyone's said it already. I think we need to make sure that everyone understands the issue and the difference between equal pay for equal work and the gender pay gap. We need to deal with the attrition, and I think that will lead to a lot of narrowing of the gender pay gap, and transparency, and then working together with our male allies. It's a little bit like I always say for women in surgery, which is close to my heart. If we make it better for women, if we say there's we make it better for women, we make it better for everybody. And this feeds a little bit into the less than full-time thing. It's our language. We've got a parenthood leaflet, not just a, you know, sort of a pregnancy maternity leaflet, as I was discussing. So language matters. And I think the recommendations are, of all the reports I read, they are, and I'm not trying to flatter you, Prof. Dave, but they're so clearly written out with areas of responsibility. I think it's important that some of the things where lots of people are responsible don't fall through the gaps. But I think it's excellent, and I can't wait for the next step of the journey. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I think we'd all echo those words. Absolutely, we would echo them. So from the perspective of Medical Women's Federation, I would just like to end by just highlighting a couple of things. A few nerdy things, such as the importance of actually getting consistent data collected and recorded across all of the various relevant organisations. You know, as an academic, you need the data. Without the data, you can't do the job, and we should be able to capture this much better. This whole conversation has been permeated through with the need to change the ethos within society. But that's work for all of us. And also to think about practical ways in which we can actually value work, caring work. It's great to value all sorts of other contributions, but let's get back to valuing the caring work that is the work of a doctor. We need to think about how we bring our junior colleagues up to speed about some of these things that many of us have learned slowly, the hard way in a long career. So that they can go into their careers with their eyes wide open. And finally, I'd say we certainly do need to celebrate, I think this was Danny's phrase, we need to celebrate these role models who break gender stereotypes. I want to finally end by saying thank you very much to all of the panelists, to Helena for hosting this with me, to BMA for joining MWF and doing this, and to our great support teams, especially Aisling Benjamin, Lucy Kerr and other colleagues from the BMA, Katie Aldridge and Danielle from MWF. We wish you luck, Carol, Jane, in getting your report implemented. And I think I can speak for both BMA and WF to say we will do our best to help you with us. So please do call upon us. We want to see this implemented. I'm going to end by saying that for those of you who may be interested to know that MWF is also picking up on this. We will be hosting a roundtable discussion on February 24th with a number of interested organisations to discuss modernising parental leave. And so we hope to watch our website. We hope to be reporting back on this February 24th meeting in due course. And let me end by saying then, thank you all very much indeed. It's been such a pleasure. And thanks to all our delegates for joining us on yet another evening webinar.
And thank you, Nina. I guess we ought to say what the BMA will be doing just before we turn the camera off. And so we're setting up a working group from our elected members, which will steer the BMA in our gender pay gap policy work. I'd also like to extend thanks to the panelists and to those whom you've mentioned, including Lucy Crowley and Jane Lewis and Steve Littlemore and Lucy Kerr and Aisling Benjamin. And to thank everyone who pre-submitted questions and joined us and posted questions today. We do have a log of the questions and any we couldn't answer tonight, and we will provide answers for those questions on the BMA website, where you should also be able to find a link to the executive summary and response from the BMA, and to tonight's recording in due course, so you can share it with colleagues and have some discussions locally. Thank you all very much. Jane, Carol, Danny, Marianne, Farah, Nina.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.